Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name is Andrew McDonald, Associate Director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, and today I think you're going to enjoy our conversation with Kelly Kapic. Kelly is a professor of theological studies at the Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia, and the award-winning author or editor of more than 15 books. His latest is You're Only Human: How Your Limits Reflect God's Design and Why That's Good News. Before we hear from Kelly, let's go to Ed Stetzer, Editor-in-Chief of Outreach Magazine and Executive Director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center.
Very cool, very cool. So good to have a conversation today. You'll notice that our normal co-host is Daniel Yang. He's not here today because Andrew McDonald, and you're like I'm on sabbatical and you have some sort of interim title as well. What is that?
So I'm the Interim Associate Director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center and the Associate Director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center Research Institute.
That's
a lot of acronyms.
Fits on a card that goes around. So good. So we're having this conversation, and we're actually recording this conversation just as this book was really recorded or mentioned or awarded the Christianity Today Theology Popular. There's like unpopular categories, but the Theology parenthetical insertion Popular Book of the Year. So we're super excited to talk about You're Only Human, how your limits reflect God's design, and that's good news. So because Andrew had a particular interest in this, he's going to co-host with me as well. So thanks to Kelly for joining us and jumping into this conversation together. We appreciate that.
It's a delight to be with you, especially with your targeted audience of pastors and leaders. This is a group I care about, especially on this message.
Well, and it's right up the alley that so many pastors and church leaders are struggling with. The timing is, some might say fortuitous. If you're at Covenant College, you'd say providential. And because, this is a time when pastors and church leaders are facing the reality of their limits. If they came into the 2020s with low resilience and at the end, their cup empty, boy, very quickly they found out some of the challenges. We're finding just the limits of who we are. So let's jump in and let's talk some about how this conversation matters. How do our struggles with our own limits show up in, we're going to get to pastoral leadership and ministry, but in just different areas, and then start there in our lives, and then let's go to the church.
Yeah, there's all kinds of examples we could give, and I would just start with my own kind of personal struggle, which my guess is maybe you two and other listeners can relate to. It's just this kind of daily sense, often at the end of my day, often even symbolically and literally as I lay my head on the pillow, where I get this sense of guilt and shame coming over me. And when I've evaluated what it is, so often it's actually this nagging question of, Kelly, why didn't you get more done today? Why didn't you do more? And, as a and I would just feel guilt or shame on that. And when there's sin, we need to repent and delight in the glory and grace of Christ. But part of the nagging problem is, am I really supposed to feel that all the time? Mm-hmm. And starting to scratch below and get at that in the sense of what unrealistic expectations, not just do I have of myself or do others have of me, but I think as a theologian, I'm very interested. If you really start to scratch at it, you find we think God has these expectations of us, and that's really hurting us. But we don't tend to realize that. So it's partly exploring that and trying to get to the good of our creation, even with our limits.
Yeah, you hit right at the beginning. You hit this really key phrase there that finitude is not a sin. And I think for people who are reading that just nails so much of kind of their feelings. Like you're talking about lying in bed and feeling this guilt and shame.
Right.
And so help us to understand, what is the relationship between sin and limit and these limitations that we feel, and how does that lie about finitude being a sin get into the kind of the pastor's heart, the leader's heart?
Yeah, because part of what's happened is we've started to imagine that our limits are the result of sin in the fall. And part of and this is partly because as evangelicals and others, we kind of have a very weak or underdeveloped doctrine of creation and the goodness of creation. And the surprise is God actually made us good, and part of the good is limits. The fancy word is finitude, but finitude just means limits of space, time, knowledge, and power. But even before there was any sin or fall in the world, we were made with limits. We were made to be dependent on God. We were made to be dependent on our neighbor. We're made to be dependent on the earth. And that dependence isn't part of sin or the fall. It's part of the good of creation. And just kind of think about it. When we, if we're talking and we said, Ed, that guy's he's really dependent on a lot of people. That doesn't sound like a compliment by and large. Right. It sounds like a negative thing. And yet if central to being truly human as God made us is the good of these dependencies, think about how hard it is to talk about spiritual formation when we in the West have so associated dependence with a problem, with a negative thing that we need to overcome, rather than this is the good. So sin isn't what makes us dependent. Sin is what distorts those dependencies, perverts them, disorders them. But there's a lot of work to be done there to rethink the good of these dependencies, which is just another way of talking about relationship.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I don't think in terms of, just my natural inclination is I don't think in terms of dependency being good. I would say to you, this conversation is not my strength. One of the things that I tend to like when people say it about me is that I tend to have a high capacity and I do a remarkable number of things. And I like that exhortation. But your book challenges and gives kind of a different path to embrace that. So what does that look like in some ways? What questions should we be asking ourselves? Being limited feels frustrating. What questions should I be asking myself? I'd rather be limitless in what I do, but what do I need to ask myself? What is Ed Stetzer, this is not his strength? And a lot of our pastors and church leaders, what do we need to be thinking?
Yeah, rather than being vague and philosophical, I think a concrete way to think about it is the question of humility. We all know, especially as leaders, yes, we should be humble. Let's talk about humility. But if you kind of explore it with Christians, our gut instinct is if someone says, why should you be humble? We say, well, because we're sinners. And yes, because we're sinners, that should contribute to our humility. But again, even before the fall, even before there was any sin in the world, Adam and Eve were meant to be humble. That means to depend on God, neighbor, and earth. And so how this actually relates is humility doesn't just say, I'm sorry, can you forgive me? Humility says, can you help me? And I don't know. That's part of it. That's part of the good. So as leaders, concrete questions are, do I ever ask questions? Am I genuinely curious? Do I think I need to solve all the problems? Do I need to have all the answers? For me, those have been painful but helpful things to explore. Am I listening as much? Am I asking as much as I'm speaking? Some of those questions are a way to dig into this.
Yeah, I guess I didn't think of it in the way, I haven't thought of it in the way you framed it. You're framing this in around not limits as negative, but limits as part of God's design, that God made us creatures and more. So it seems that I need to embrace the creatureliness and the limitations that God designed. But it also does seem that I remember Wayne Cordero and I were teaching a class together, and Wayne said that, people have different plates. You want to keep your plate full for what you're doing, but some people's plates are larger and can handle more. Some people's plates are smaller. But clearly the implication was that the bigger plate is better. And the smaller plate is, I don't know that Wayne would have said that, but that's how I heard it in my sinful self. So, so this is going to be applied differently to different people because we're created differently. Yep. So how do we think about this? How do we stretch ourselves to do better and more, but also acknowledge the limitations that come in God's good design and creation?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Because, athletes only become good athletes when they think they've come up against their limit and they push through it, right? So I'm not naive about that. Limits, it's a bit of a tricky business. Intellectually, you and I teach in college and graduate schools, and we need to help students push through some of those limits. So what does that look like? And I guess I would reframe it a little bit and just say, for me, one of the aha moments has been the discovery that I realize I've made productivity and efficiency my highest values, and they're not God's highest values. God, no matter how you think God made the world and when he made the world, everybody can agree on this, that God could have made it in a millisecond. And the fact that he doesn't make it in a millisecond, whether it's 6 24-hour days or 6 trillion, is irrelevant. He is comfortable with process. And part of working through that is productivity and efficiency, which are values for God. They're not his highest. His highest value is love. And so when it comes to that, we are all different. One of the ways we test, is this a healthy pushing through our limits, or is it unhealthy? Is this bringing about shalom, or is it undermining it? How is this affecting relationships? How is this affecting relationship with God, neighbor, earth? That would be part of the, just a concrete way to start to think through it, I think.
Yeah. But I can hear, Kelly, I can hear people like just screaming on the other end of this, that's all well and good, but what about other people and how they view us, like the value system that we seem to be in? Like, it would be great to walk in and say, I've hit God is teaching me about my finitude and about my limits and all that. And then your boss or your coworkers are like, that's great, now get back to work.
Right.
And so how do we deal with the culture of value, that places this frustration on us, that this value of how your outputs and all these different things? We're within something here that seems to be in some ways trapping, I think people would say.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And there are some individual kind of pious practices we can cultivate, but you're also pointing to larger structural issues, right? Structural sin and challenges. And we can't be naive to that. But I also honestly think that's partly why this stuff resonates with people. Is stress, for example, is a good gift from God. He made us, and we're using these words in some general ways in this context, but he made us so that if you hear the, the sound of a lion roar, you're able to run a little faster, right? When you're walking through a dark alley, your attention's a bit up, right? And you can handle that. You have final exams, you can push, right? Stress actually can be a positive thing. It's actually how you need some stress on bones for them to get strong. The problem is we've taken a good gift and we've made it a terrible master. And where stress is meant to be episodic, we've made it a lifestyle. So when you're asking, when bosses and others have all these expectations, one of the questions is just, but is it realistic in any way? It's fascinating. There's a guy, Oliver Berkman, New York, he's written bestsellers on time management, and his recent book is called 4,000 Weeks. And it's, I don't know if you've seen it. And it's fascinating because from what I can tell, I don't think he's a believer. He's engaged with some Christian literature, but basically it's someone who's written all these time management books. And he has this aha moment where he realizes all of us who are talking about time management are actually just trying to deny our mortality. And here's this guy who's just not from a position of faith saying, why do we feel guilty for not getting more done when it's just impossible and unrealistic, whether it's bosses or employees? So you're asking good questions that require both individual and corporate rethinking. And that's a longer conversation, but I do think the fact that people have unrealistic expectations of us, at some point, the only way you start to change it is by having honest conversations, trying to, and I'll end with this. I think part of what the church needs to do in our day as an apologetic and witness is to help people reimagine what a humane life looks like.
Fascinating. Okay. So again, the book, in case you're joining us late, I don't know how you could join us late. I have a radio show, so I'm used to saying that.
Podcast.
It's a podcast.
So
you're not really
clicked in the middle.
But I have a radio show. So I'm like, hey, if you're driving down the road, anyway, it's You're Only Human, how your limits reflect God's design and why that's good news. So I think I can affirm that it's true. Your limits do reflect God's design. Though again, again, your book challenged me to think and challenges me to think that way. You've already talked some about how the pace, and again, this is helpful. Again, you'll find this in the book, is the pace that God accomplishes his tasks. He didn't need to do it over this span of time. You didn't address some, but it's probably worth going down the road some in our conversation about Christology. It's in the book, but in the Christology, the limitations of Jesus as an incarnated human does relate to this topic as well. Take us down that road theologically for a bit.
Yeah, I love that you asked that, since when we're recording it, it's Advent season. And for me, part of what has captured me with this idea in the last 20, 25 years in particular is the humanity of Jesus. And for example, there's this early church father Tertullian, and he has this amazing book called De Carne Christi, the carnage, the flesh of Christ. And he's meditating on the significance of Jesus. And he talks about Mary's afterbirth. Now think about that, When was the last time in a sermon you heard reflections on Mary's afterbirth? But he's talking about how theologically significant it is, right? This is actually very earthy. And he's attacking the Gnostics in his day who are very uncomfortable with God and the flesh, because the flesh is very unspiritual and bad. And he's saying, no. The afterbirth, this significance of Jesus's connection to Mary represents God's great yes to creation. The God who loved what he made doesn't hate it now. He loves it enough to remake it. And he loves it and he affirms it by entering into it. And the infinite God enters into finitude in and through the incarnate Christ. And just starting to explore that's pretty staggering, because it's like us in all ways, yet without sin, including this reality of finitude.
Yeah. And I think, yes, I mean, this is ultimately part of what we learn from the coming of Jesus and the incarnation, fully God and fully man. I'm trying to press a little more though, because I want to say that observation is true, but how has that observation caused me to think differently about the bad pace that I admittedly do have and take in my life? So I want to push you a little more.
Yeah.
How does that, what is that? I mean, I can say these things are true. How does it impact me to live differently?
In terms of incarnation, I mean, part of what's so staggering is Jesus's full life. So much of the Gospels concentrates just on the final years and particularly the final weeks of his life. And sometimes people think, well, that means his life overall, maybe that didn't really matter. But actually, the reason why we don't have a lot about the rest of his life seems to be because it's so ordinary. In other words, what makes the news is what's newsworthy and different. We don't read a lot about Jesus dying with belly laughter, not because he didn't, but because he would have. It's a very human thing to do, all these kind of things. And so part of it is just trying to figure out how comfortable is God, how comfortable is Christ with this reality of being an earthly creature. And it is true, again, given our particular audience here, it is true. You have Jesus tell the disciples after a full day, listen, we need to get away and pray. And then all of a sudden they get out in the boat and they get to the other side and there's a crowd, and he wanted to retreat. And instead they have to push themselves because Jesus says, no, I'm like these are sheep without a shepherd. So he pushes himself. And at times in ministry, you still need to do that. You need to go beyond what you think your limit is. But when you keep reading, then he goes away still, because he still needs the quiet. He still needs the alone. He still needs the restoration. And so there is this sense of, what unrealistic expectations do we have of ourselves? And of leaders, I do think we are compassionate to our congregation, and we said, God really loves you. He really accepts you. You're not your work. But no matter what our words say, if we are modeling to them, we never stop, we never say no, then how can they really believe the benediction we're pronouncing over them? Right. So that's part of the challenge.
So just a couple months ago, we had the Litvin Symposium here, where I remember Alan Noble said something really profound, where he was talking about rest and taking rest for the sake of rest. At the Wheaton College,
we did a symposium, right?
And so Alan Noble was talking about the importance of rest for the sake of rest, not to recharge your batteries to get back in. It's not an effectiveness.
I didn't like that talk.
Yeah,
because I'm just being transparent.
I know.
Go ahead.
I know, but he talked about rest, and that resonated with me in terms of your book, because the idea of rest as worship, this idea that worship worship and rest have kind of almost like a cyclical relationship with each other. And so I'm interested in how can leaders, going all the way back to your point about guilt and shame, how can worship help pastors address some of those underlying issues, that when they take breaks, they feel guilty, when they're off with their family, they feel like they need to be back at the church, their emails are piling up. How can pastors use worship to address those underlying problems?
Very good.
Yeah, that's great. And Alexander Schwemin, Eastern Orthodox theologian, decades ago, he defined secularism as the negation of worship. And what's fascinating about his definition is this is something, therefore, that Christians can be secular in this kind of way. In other words, we can do these practices, we can do these things, but is it actual worship? What are we doing? So when you say, how does worship fit into this? There is a bit of a warning right at the beginning is, well, are we making worship another task? Is it another thing that we want to be efficient? Is it like the recharge? And part of what's amazing is worship, like love, is inefficient. And I think that's super hard for us. I think it's hard for us to just be with God because it honestly feels so inefficient. And so you ask most Christians, including most leaders, do you pray like you think you should? And the answer is almost always no.
Sure.
But if we explore why, it's often no one wants to say it. It's because it feels like a waste of time. I'm not doing anything. I'm wasting time. God has stuff for me to do. And so one of the test cases of our view of, are we really a creature, and do we really believe we are who God says we are, and he is who he says he is the cultivation of worship and prayer. And prayer, not just God, I need you, I need you, I need you, although it is that, but it's also expressions of gratitude are a way of expressing our lament, right?
It's interesting because so Andrew wanted to have you on. He sort of he set this up and then he invited himself as co-host. There's Daniel's perfectly available. He's in his office right now. And because I and part of me I wonder if this is like an intervention for me. But
we did call
fine.
this meeting for you, Ed.
Yeah, exactly. That's fine. I don't mind a good intervention. So
You're safe here.
I'm safe. It's a safe place. So but I totally want to say that I feel it, see it, want it, need it. But I speak for, we tens of thousands of wonderful people who are listening to this podcast, and most of them are working and serving in places that they're pastors of a local church. And I'm going to say to the church, hey, I'm going to rest more is not going to be the thing that's immediately received well by this. They're expected to maybe grow the church, or maybe they're, trying to get out of COVID and, what do we look like? How do we recover our attendance levels and all this sort of stuff? So if the expectations challenge is part of the challenge we have to face, but we also have maybe the pulpit or the Bible study, how do we simultaneously as pastors and church leaders teach and lead in these things? Let me remind everyone that the book is You're Only Human: How Your Limits Reflect God's Design and Why That is Good News. So I read it. I agree. It's good news. How do I get the body of believers that I'm leading to buy into this for themselves and not just see me as saying I need a vacation?
Yeah. No, it's a great question, because what can't be is it's just a pastor who feels tired and they just need a break. Which I don't doubt. I mean,
there's that.
Anyone
that's
who's been in ministry in the last 6 years, all the pastors and pastor groups I speak to, they're all wiped out. And most of, if they can do anything else, many of them are leaving. So that's a group I care a lot about. But you're right. A congregation is not going to resonate if it just feels like the pastor. But the reality is the congregation is made up of so many people that are feeling this. And I mean, I have a lot of stay-at-home parents with little kids who are not making money in outside employment who feel these exact things. There are teenagers who are feeling these exact things. So it's actually it's not the pastor's problem. So I do think there are hard questions to ask. Are we doing too much as a church? Right? We all know the statistics are kind of an 80-20 or 75, split, where 20% of the church or less does the vast majority of work. And everyone knows if more people do more and fewer, that's good for everybody. But I really do think it takes incredible courage to think about this and to talk about it. And so the advice I would give to the leaders is, rather than trying to say, I need to sneak in an excuse, or this is about me, it's, well, if you're the pastor, you need to start cultivating in the church a different sanctified imagination. I would put it this, I think that's a different way to go. What is the imagination? I do think the apologetics in our day I think I want to write about this is go therefore and make humans. Because I think discipleship in our day that's so countercultural is to present a humane existence in an increasingly inhumane world.
Wow.
And so I think the pastors can talk into that.
I mean, you hit on a piece a little bit ago about like the apologetic, and I think that you had a phrase in the book that it takes an entire community to reflect one Messiah, which seemed very kind of Leslie Newbegin-ish to me in terms of like the role of the congregation as the demonstration of the gospel. So help us understand how embodying this truth can impact how church leaders and pastors can see other people outside of their church, as well as be an apologetic to the community.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, take, for example, Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats episode, where the thing that separates the sheep and the goat, do you clothe the naked, feed the hungry, visit prisoners, those kind of things. Like, what in the world do you do with that? And I tell the story sometimes. I had a former student who's now in ministry. He pours himself out for college students. He does this great ministry, but he he called me in all earnestness and just said, I've been meditating on Matthew 25, and I don't know if I'm a sheep or a goat. And you're like, this guy's been to seminary, he's in ministry, but he's like, I have no money. I have no time to go to food shelter. I can't visit prisoners. And we dismiss him like, hey, why are you so anxious? But to his credit, he's taking the scriptures, he's taking the red letter seriously, right? But so I think we have this tension in our churches because we have a rise of activism of people who see legitimate injustices and needs in our world and want to address them. And then people who have seen all the burnout in the church and are responding by saying like, no, that's just political. And Matthew 25, I think, is a great example because Jesus isn't joking around. So the answer I ended up giving to that guy, which I comfort myself with, is that this week I have shared the gospel with people in Nepal, and I've prayed at the bedside of a sick child in the hospital. And I've helped people who are recovering from being sex trafficked. And I've done all these things, not because Kelly has done them, but because by the Spirit, I am united to the people of God. And it takes the whole church to be the one body of Christ. And so I do think pastorally, the more we can affirm, even though we all know this, it's all the parts of the body, everyone needs to be honored, but reimagining and think about like, no, we do need to care about prisoners and injustice, but it can really matter to God. But it doesn't mean that you personally need to do everything. And our problem is we feel like if it's valuable and important, then I must do it. And that's where our individualism is hurting us. If we affirm the community, then it's wonderful that there are things that are happening, even stuff we don't know about. The problem is if there's no one in our communities doing these things, then we've got big issues.
Yeah, I want to connect this book a little bit with your previous one, Embodied Hope. And both of them Embodied Hope touch so much more on suffering and pain and kind of the hope of the gospel in the midst of kind of a lot of these things. But the common thread that I saw between both of them is kind of paying attention to the rhythms of kind of how we've subverted and kind of missed the point of what kind of human existence is. And I think your point about go forward and make humans is a big piece. But how do you see the connection between the two pieces, the previous one on pain and suffering, and now kind of calling attention to our human limitations? Do you see the two as connected, or are two different pieces?
Yeah, thank you for asking that and picking that up. That's very thoughtful of you. Some people have told me now who'd read Embodied Hope and then read You're Only Human, like now I want to read them in reverse because, and I really do think it was only the short for your audience. The short story is just my wife and I were married in 1993. She got cancer in 2008. We were married 9 years before we had kids. So we had little kids at the time. In God's grace, she got through cancer, was declared cancer free. But since 2010, every day to this day deals with pretty serious chronic pain and fatigue. And so this book, Embodied Hope, is wrestling through pain and suffering. And so part of it is, and you know, even getting back to some of what Ed was asking about earlier, my wife and I are both, I don't know if it's type A people. We like to get things done. And all of this is taken and stripped things away. And we needed to create margin in our life. And then the reality is like, nope, we need to cut more out, and we need to cut more out, and we need to cut more out. And I do think, to be perfectly honest, finitude and the good of our limits doesn't tend to come to us unless it's forced on us for various reasons.
Hmm.
So I do think I was only able to finally write what I wanted to about the goodness of creation after I had written about lament and sin and brokenness.
Wow.
And because I think without lament, if you just talk about the goodness of creation, we end up lying and making a plastic creation. It's not being honest about how hard it is.
Yeah, in addition to being intervention time for me, I think it's good for a lot of pastors and church leaders as we're thinking about these kinds of issues. So come back with me to the pastor and church leader audience and some steps because we need steps, which, we're only human, to quote the book title.
Yeah.
What can we take steps now to embrace our limits, live more fully, embrace the creatureness of who we are, and kind of your closing thoughts for our audience.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things is, again, I don't know when this will come out, but right now we're talking mid-December, and this is as you know, this is a brutal time it's a wonderful time, but a brutal time for churches. I was speaking to a large church I was just speaking to their pastors and staff in Texas not too long ago, and they had the head janitor there. And he just raised it. He just said, here's the thing. I haven't had a day off. My crew's been working 7 days a week for the last 15 days. And so he's like, we're dying. We can't do any more events. So I do think what I would say is, listen, December is packed, but can we get back to seasons? There's a reason why the church calendar is important, where there are times of Advent and Easter but there's also regular seasons. They're normal, and those are longer. And so do we allow our leaders and our congregations to have those rhythms, or are we making, if every day is important, nothing's important, right? So I do think rhythm is a step to go, what are ways we can cultivate that again? What are ways that we can honor rest in our churches and in ourselves? The 1 in 7 pattern, but beyond. And I do think no one, as you guys know, no one's going to fight for the pastor to rest. And this gets difficult. And it sounds selfish, but for the good of your congregation, you need to set aside time to be unproductive. You need to set aside time to be with God and to listen. And I really encourage quiet. And I think it's just so hard. It's hard for me. But yeah, we could talk about that for a long. The last chapter deals with some practical steps, if that helps people.
And I want to commend people again to pick up the book. I think people will find it helpful. It's You're Only Human: How Your Limits Reflect God's Design, and how that's good news. I will tell you that receiving the intervention, just living in the UK for the last few months and kind of fellowshipping some with the, there at Oxford with the evangelicals there, who sort of have a much more rootedness and restedness to them. It's fascinating how a lot of this is an American thing. Not all of it, but a lot of it's an American thing. So again, thank you for taking the time with us. We're talking to Dr. Charlie Kapic. He's the author of the new book, You're Only Human. And as always, thanks for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You'll find more interviews as well as other great content for ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And if you found our conversation helpful, take a few moments, leave us a review. That helps other people find the podcast as well. Free resources for pastors and church leaders. And hopefully you benefited from the content today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.